A Conversation on Consciousness with Dr. Christof Koch. Dr. Christof Koch is the president and chief scientist of the Allen Institute for Brain Science and known for his work on the neural correlates and theory of consciousness. Dr. Koch has authored over 300 scientific papers and 5 books, including the recently published book, The Feeling of Life Itself, Why Consciousness is Widespread but Can't be Computed. At the Allen Institute, Dr. Koch leads the effort to fully understand the physical transformations of signals in the visual system of the mouse, an effort that has so far involved more than 300 scientists and funding over $500 million. On consciousness, Dr. Koch is known for his close collaboration with Professor Giulio Tononi on Integrated Information Theory, IIT, a theory that begins from a first-person experience of consciousness and associates consciousness with fundamental properties of certain physical systems. Okay, good. So, yeah, Dr. Koch, or Christof, if you prefer.
Yes.
Perhaps it would be best if we can just start by immediately addressing the book that you've recently published, The Feeling of Life Itself, and Why Consciousness is Widespread but Can't be Computed. Could you say a few words about the book?
By a few words, you mean, should I explain
yes,
the theory, or what do you mean by?
Yeah, I'm sure you had a purpose in writing the book, right? There's a specific message you want to get across. Maybe you want to get to that.
So so the book has two purposes. One is to update the reader. So as you may know, I've been involved for probably a third of a century in looking for what's now called the neuronal correlates of consciousness. So this is a term that Francis Crick and I originated back in the late 1980s, when we said, well, the philosophical problems don't look like they're going to be resolved anytime soon. But in the meantime, with this wonderful technology that enables us to track what's the neural correlates of consciousness, the minimum physical mechanisms that are jointly necessary for any one conscious sensation. And then you can ask, where are they in the brain? Presumably in the brain. And is there some commonality between the NCC, the neural correlates of consciousness, for seeing and smelling and hearing? Are they in one area? Are they one cell type? Is a particular type of connection or neurotransmitter, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of research has happened and discovery over the last 10 or 20 years. And the other thing is not only this empirical program of looking for the footprints of consciousness in the brain. That program will undoubtedly, sooner or later, come sort of to the layer of consciousness in the brain and will identify the set of neurons or neural mechanisms or physical mechanisms that are sort of the physical substrate of consciousness. But we want to know more. We want to know who else has it, what happens in severely impaired patients, where we're not sure are they conscious, like Terry Schiavo, some of the listener may remember, a patient who was in a vegetative state. What about a fetus? What about a severely demented individual? What about a cat, a dog, a fly, a worm, C. elegans, a protozoa? How far does consciousness go? When does it start? When does it end? And ultimately, can machines be conscious? And so for that, we really need a fundamental theory of consciousness. And so I talk about this, one of the two sort of most popular scientific theories of consciousness called integrated information theory. And it has these two conclusions that make up the subtitle of my book, that A, consciousness is quite widespread, much more widespread than at least we in the West like to believe, and B, that it's not a computational thing. You can't compute it. You actually have to build it into the physics of the substrate itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, so for you, because you were already working on the neural correlates of consciousness, and then you wanted to look at what is the best theory that you wanted to think about in this at this time, at least, or the theory that attracts you the most. I can see that certainly, but I'm very curious about where IIT began itself. And I know maybe I should be asking Tononi about this, but
Yes.
But certainly, if you could tell us something about how it came about, because often that's very instructive about understanding a theory, is to know, for instance, did it begin with phenomenology, did it begin with intuition, or something else?
Yeah, I mean, usually it begins with some intuition you have, whether that's physical or phenomenological. But this theory, so there are sort of two dominant scientific ways of looking at consciousness. And I think they're really well encapsulated by sort of the two currently most popular theories of consciousness. One is called the global neuronal workspace theory, that comes from Bernie Bass and then Stan Dehaene and Jean-Pierre Changeux in Paris. And the other one is integrated information theory. And one really says, one starts with experience itself, with phenomenology. So IET says consciousness exists for itself, but it's structured. It is the way it is. It is, in a particular form, and it's integrated. It's one. It's holistic, and it's definite. It has definite borders. There's certain things that are in, and certain things that are out, and you can think of them like 5 properties of any conscious experience, no matter how bizarre, how strange, how elated, or how banal. Every conscious experience sort of exists for itself, is structured, is one, and is only one. And then it proceeds from there. It asks, well, what is it about a physical system, a substrate, a computer network, or a bunch of neurons, or whatever else that has these 5 properties? And it derives a mathematical calculus, in terms of these intrinsic causal powers, and it derives finally a quantity called phi. It's also called integrated information, which is a little bit confusing because information here has nothing to do with Shannon information. It's not information that you send from A to B. It's really information in the older Aristotelian sense, informare, to give form to. And this number phi, or this integrated information, is essentially the extent to which a system exists for itself, the extent to which a system is irreducible, the extent to which a system is conscious. It's a number either 0 or positive. If it's 0, the system doesn't exist, properly speaking, for itself. It can be divided into subcomponents. It does not exist as a system. It's not conscious. It's fully reducible. The bigger this number phi, the more conscious it is. So the theory derives this number, which is a quantity of consciousness, but it also says, it also precisely gives a mathematical calculus, which is this intrinsic causal power, that says, what is it about the quality of conscious experience? Why is that a space? If I look at space, if I look at an empty canvas, imagine a complete black screen. It has lots of phenomenology. It has close by, farther away, the distance relationship, right? There's above, there's below, there's left, there's right. Where do these phenomenological aspects of space come from? And then it asks, okay, now let's look at the physical substrate. And where is this physical substrate in the brain? So it goes from phenomenology to mechanism to brains.
Yeah.
The other approach, global neuronal workspace, is very different. It looks at the architecture of the brain, particularly its frontal part, right? And it says there's something about the frontal part that matches this architecture known as a blackboard architecture. And this seems to implement some of the properties that we associated with consciousness. In particular, once I'm conscious of something, that information isn't encapsulated in little bits and modules, but is globally available to my planning, to my speaking, to my memory. And so it proceeds more from the architecture to saying, well, these aspects of the architecture explain what it is to be conscious. So it's quite a different animal. These theories also take very different points of view about the ontology of consciousness. They take really 2 very different points of view. Ultimately, IET says what exists are only causal power, either intrinsic causal power, the causal power the system has upon itself. That's ultimately what consciousness is, and extrinsic, external causal power. That's what you measure in physics. The ability of one particle to attract another particle by its charge or by its mass. So ultimately, it says there's consciousness. It is the most real thing there is, and there's a substrate. That's all there is. The rest is just void. Yeah, so to speak with the Epicureans, there's just causal power in the void. While global neuronal workspace says, well, there isn't really any, it's sort of more like Dan Dennett. There really isn't anything above and beyond sort of there's the physics of the system, which is very complicated. And people clearly say that they're conscious, but they're really confused about it. There isn't anything special about consciousness.
Okay.
This is interesting because I hear you saying that integrated information theory is coming from the phenomenology and working its way towards consciousness, whereas global workspace theory is coming from the architecture and working its way towards consciousness, which surprisingly, when I was speaking with, say, Michael Graziano, for instance, you would give the opposite interpretation. He would say that, for instance, his attention schema theory, which is sort of related to global workspace theory in a sense, it's a sort of same sort of thinking. It comes from phenomenology, whereas as he wasn't sure if integrated information theory did do that. But to get to a more specific question, you had mentioned a lot of different ways in which there can be a level of consciousness, or at least it sounded to me like that. You were mentioning the irreducibility, and I think there are others such as intensity and so forth. And that's actually a question that I had, which is when you talk about the level of consciousness, with phi being a measure of that, what is that level? Is it all of these things? Is it a specific one? Is it complexity or some other dimension?
No, so phi is not sort of a level. It's sort of really the quantity. It's the irreducibility. It's the amount of causal power. It's so in the human brain, of course, there's also arousal, right? If I haven't slept in 2 days, I have a very low arousal. If you wake me up in the middle of deep sleep, you know, my arousal level is low. But when I'm conscious, conscious itself, either I'm conscious of something or I'm not conscious of something. Now, if my brain is smaller or if I'm just a fly, I can also be conscious. It feels like something to be a fly, but what it feels like is, of course, vastly less differentiated than what I feel like or what you feel like. Right? A fly doesn't have an inner voice. A fly doesn't have a psychology. A fly won't feel obese or upset, it won't have sophisticated states. It might be angry. It might be fearful. It might be elated when it's just gotten, sucked some, if it's a mosquito, if it's just sucked some blood. It might be happy in that sense. It has a reward mechanism, not unrelated to our reward mechanism, but it doesn't have a complicated, highly complicated states of consciousness. So phi can vary from very little to really a lot in a full-grown adult that's highly introspective and that has a highly developed cortex.
Mm-hmm. Is there any cap on phi? Is there any maximum level at all?
No, it depends on the underlying physical structure. It goes from 0 to any positive number. It really just depends on the substrate. And of course, there's no reason why it should be maximized in human. It just happens to be on this planet. It's probably maximal in Homo sapiens. Of course, it also says that, my level of consciousness might be different. Yours might be higher or lower. And of course, we also know it in my lifetime, right? Early on, when I'm a child, I don't think a lot about myself. I have very little introspection. I may never have any sexual experience, right? Later on, I fall in love. I discover sex. I discover drugs. I discover wine. And so all of that enlarges my consciousness. Towards the end of my life, I might get dementia, and then, my level of consciousness, will go down again. So it waxes and wanes. Mm-hmm. Across daily cycle, across my life, and across people and across species.
Okay, yeah. Now, one of the things that I'm very curious about, as with any scientific theory, is of course what sort of predictions can be made, and predictions then lead to, for instance, being able to falsify a theory if they, or at least find some problem with it if they can't make a proper prediction or the prediction is wrong in some sense. And I think this is especially interesting right now because, of course, the Templeton Foundation has decided to fund work to try to test IIT and global workspace theory. And I had a nice conversation with Heather Berlin about that at South by Southwest. But at the time, she had no idea or didn't want to tell me how they were going to test this. Is there now some notion of how you can test IIT versus global workspace?
Yeah, we have a pre-registered report that's submitted. We're going to submit it soon and then make it public for everyone. Yeah, so we're making specific. So this process is a very interesting one. So that we got together in Seattle here at my institute, and the proponents, in particular Stan Hain and Giulio Tononi and a bunch of other people, including Heather. Yeah. And we said, okay, let's think about a common experiment that we can all agree on, where we agree on the experiment and we agree, okay, if this is the outcome, it supports IAT. If that's the outcome, it supports GNW. Okay. And so we have two experiments essentially that we're testing in a lot of people, 500 subjects, using three techniques: fMRI, EEG and MEG together, and then ECOG. So ECOG is a technique you can use in epileptic patients that have electrodes, implanted onto their cortex, which gives you higher resolution, more direct access to electrical signals. And we're essentially testing NCC, because the two series make quite different predictions. Global Neural Workspace essentially says the NCC really has to involve prefrontal cortex. GNW, IAT says, no, not necessarily. It may or may not. That's really not necessary. That more relates to planning and intelligence and task setting. It's really the posterior part of cortex. The two theories also differ on the timing. When I'm conscious of something like you, so let's say I look at you for many seconds. Unless you change or I move my eyes, when I'm conscious of you, GNW says there's only this initial wave when I first become conscious of you. But then if nothing changes, that isn't updated anymore. While IAT says, no, as long as I'm conscious, there's going to be the maximal irreducible cause-effect power. If I'm conscious of you for 1 minute, it's going to be there for 1 minute. So it makes different prediction on concerning the time scale. We're now getting ready. It's been funded. We had a big meeting last month at this Society of Neuroscience. There are like 10 labs in 3 continents. And what we're doing, the first year, we're just collecting the data, no analysis. In the second year, we're analyzing half of all the data, and we're freezing the methods. And then the third year, we take those methods that are published ahead of time, they can't be changed anymore, and apply them on the second half of data that hasn't been looked at yet to see, do they really generalize? In order to really have a robust, a statistically highly robust ways of ascertaining the results. And then everything will be made available. All the data on all 500 subjects, on both experiments, in all these modalities will be made available to anyone, and so anybody can test it and do their own analysis.
Okay, that's wonderful. I really, really look forward to that, actually.
Yeah, it's a pretty cool thing. It's a pretty cool thing.
Yeah, so one of the things that I find, theories like global workspace and others that are a little bit like it are often useful for is that they try in some sense to explain or make predictions about what we might call third-person consciousness, so conscious behavior in a sense. And I'm wondering what IIT says about that, or is there a way to make explanations for third-person consciousness, or is it really
no, for better or not? So again, this is where the two theories differ. It's really interesting to look and contrast them. So IIT doesn't say anything. It's not a cognitive theory. It doesn't talk about attention. It doesn't talk about planning or language, or in a full theory of the human brain. All of that will have to be incorporated, but that doesn't talk about it. It really talks about consciousness, how to measure it, right? It has derived this tool, this conscious meter that's being tested in many patients now. Yeah. While GNW, its strength, if you want, is it makes some precise predictions about the cognitive involvement, about various cognitive modules like short-term memory and like planning. So it is just differences, the interesting differences between the two theories, reflecting their fundamental different origin, where they started from, phenomenology versus sort of cognition, cognition and neuroscience.
Yeah. So the one thing that we've stayed away from so far in this conversation is, of course, the big conclusions of IIT. So, for instance, the conclusions about what can be computed or not computed, or simulated or not simulated. And I know that you and Tononi have both said things about simulation, such as it is not possible to simulate consciousness on a von Neumann computer. In that sense, is that still something that you would say as well?
Oh yeah, I have an entire chapter on it. Let me put it even more stark. Many of your audience will. Let's assume Henry Markham. Have you talked about Henry Markham's Human Brain Project?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so let's assume it's going to take him 100 years and not just another 2 years. Okay, and in 100 years from now, there's this perfect model of the human brain where every neuron and every synapse is simulated in software on some, running on the cloud in various IBMs or whatever quantum computers, let's say, okay?
Yeah.
But they're essentially for Neumann machines. That's the important thing, right? And so, of course, if you got it right, of course, the simulation will, quote, wake up and will say I'm conscious, just like Alexa does already now. You can ask Alexa, right?
Yeah.
If the simulation is good enough, of course, it'll mimic all of human behavior. But it's a deep fake. Why is it a deep fake? So so there are two sort of separate arguments here. One is it's the same argument that you can make why it doesn't get wet inside a computer that simulates a rainstorm, or why. To me, as a physicist, there's even a better example. So I have a friend, she's an astrophysicist at Caltech, okay? So she writes down the 10 equations of Einstein's general relativity theory, right? And then she models those for the mass at the center of our galaxy that weighs roughly 10 to the 6 solar masses, right? And she simulates a black hole, right? What she simulates, it's our best understanding at the center of our galaxy, that there is this mass that is so large that it twists space-time around it that nothing, not even light, can escape, okay?
Right.
But funnily enough, I don't have to be concerned that she's going to get sucked into a simulation.
Although, of course, any person being simulated within the simulation, so something that lives in the simulation would experience this as a real black hole.
But the point is, I'm talking now about the real world. In the real world, where physics matters, in the real world, it does not have the causal power of gravity. You can simulate aspects of gravity, but you cannot simulate the causal effect of gravity.
Yeah.
You actually have to build it into the system. That means you actually have to create a big mass that weighs, 1 million solar masses. Same thing with consciousness. Consciousness ultimately is something physical. It's causal power upon itself.
Right? That's an assumption.
That's what the theory says. Of course, the theory could be wrong. The theory is an empirical theory. It could be wrong. But the theory says ultimately consciousness is something physical. It's causal power upon itself. So you have to build a physical causal power into the system. Now you can do that. You can build, for example, what people call neuromorphic engineering. Right? If you make, for example, CPUs, and IBM is trying to do this, and the people at Nirvana, that Intel brought up, are trying to do something like this, where you build the massive fan-in, that we have in our brains, where you have 50,000 neurons converging onto one neuron, and then the output goes towards 50,000 other neurons with massive overlap, both in the input as well as in the output. Then you would get human level consciousness. There's nothing magic about this thing. It's a physical system like any other physical system, but it's a physical system of a particular time. So consciousness is not a clever hackaway. It is not true, or it's a delusion that most people in Silicon Valley suffer from, that if only we make Alexa a little bit cleverer, if we just have a little bit more, computational power, soon Alexa and Cortana and Siri and, all the other ones will be conscious. No, they might behave like they're conscious, but that's very different. It's behavior. There is no consciousness. It's fake.
But that's, of course, based on an assumption that you can say that is fake, right? Because how would you really tell if you're encountering a robot that claims that it has consciousness and behaves conscious? How would you be able to say, no, you're really not conscious because I know that you happen to be built according to a von Neumann machine?
Yes. So
it's really a theory, right?
Yeah. So two things. A, what this implies, as you sort of made implicit, there is, in principle, you can't have a Turing test for consciousness. And of course, Alan Turing himself realized that and was careful not to say this is a test for consciousness, but this is a test for whether you can consider, that machines is capable of having thoughts. So you really have to have a validated theory of consciousness that ultimately has to be validated in the only object that we know is conscious, which is me and you.
Yeah.
Right. So just like relativity, how do we know about black holes? Having never been inside a black hole, well, because we build up confidence in gravitation, testing it here on the planet and testing it in in the nearby solar system and other things, and then we say, well, we're going to extrapolate it to very far out things like black holes, rips in space-time. Same thing, it has to happen here. And it might be wrong. It's an empirical thing.
Yes, yes. This is actually a reason why I was so interested in the origins of IIT, because I was trying to gauge to what extent it is based on an intuition about what consciousness seems like.
It is based on the following intuition, Randall, which is the central intuition behind much of Western philosophy. Cogito ergo sum. Je pense, donc je suis. 1642 in Utrecht by René Descartes. Okay.
Yeah,
Finally, the only way I know I exist is because I'm conscious. Everything else is a abstraction, right? Everything else, the laws of physics, all of that is sort of I infer. The only thing I know, I paint, I pleasure, so therefore I know I exist.
Yes, yeah, I totally agree with that. The thing that I worry about is illusions, because of course our visual system already presents us with so many illusions. How do we know that much of what we think that consciousness is like isn't an illusion, such as the notion that we are in the moment aware of so many integrated things, rather than, say, paying attention right now because I'm trying to remember what I was aware of, paying attention to what I was hearing, and then paying attention to what I was seeing, all things that have been produced and given to me by other parts of the brain and that have been deposited into a working memory somewhere. How do we know that the report we're creating isn't itself a report that the machine that is supposed to say, yes, I'm conscious and this is what I'm aware of, is producing? How do we know it really is a report of an in the moment?
The only way, for example, yeah, that's a good question. So we have to test the idea that as Ned Block, the philosopher Ned Block would put it, that phenomenal consciousness vastly overflows what I can push, what I can report with a button press, or with, you know, by talking about it in a very short term. Because that's a tiny channel. That's like it's drinking from the ocean through a straw. While I have this vast, you know, phenomenological consciousness, like even just as I said, the phenomenology of space is vast, but then I can only talk about it very slowly, or only, you know, and an experimentalist puts me in a straitjacket where he says, well, you have to push either left button or right button. That's the only thing I know, left or right, or up or down, or male or female, or blue and red. Well, if you ask me as such a stupid question, I can only give you a very stupid answer, yes or no.
Yeah.
But you have to test it.
Indeed, yeah. So I'm not sure, of course, if the tests that the Templeton Foundation is hoping to pay for at this moment are going to get there, or if that's for the future at some point.
That's what So as I said, so what this is, it tests two predictions of the two different theories. To the extent that these predictions will be wrong, of course, you can begin to question the underlying premise of one or the other theory, but it doesn't directly test the underlying premise. That's entirely correct.
Okay, yeah. So now coming back to, I guess, the topic that our listeners are probably most interested in. They want to know, well, how does this all affect whole brain emulation? I think one thing is very obvious, which is that, of course, you would say you need to have something that is like a neuromorphic type of substrate to build something like an emulated brain on. But I'm also curious about the other aspect of it, which we won't really get into. Personal identity is a whole other big topic, but let's say, for example, that you can create a machine that has a certain type of state space that looks or that seems like it is the same as whatever is producing your qualia. This would mean that is that machine then you? And what if you create 10 of them? Are they all you? Do you have any thoughts about that, or is that just going way too far to science fiction?
Yeah, so now you're talking about the identity and self-identity. No,
I know it's a little bit further out. Yeah,
but I find it silly. It's like, I don't know. I don't find it very productive because, look, we all know. So let's say I have a fancy technology that enables me to take my brain, somehow scan it, and build a neuromorphic equivalent machine. Okay. From that point, this machine will have its own identity. Early on, it's going to be me. It's going to be like my completely identical twin. But then, of course, it will rapidly diverge from me because it has different experiences. It goes out in the world and does other things. So it's going to acquire different. I find this very obvious. I don't see why. Yeah, and if you make 10 copies of it, that early on there will be 10 copies of things that will feel very similar to me, but then they'll acquire different experiences. They will too.
I think I agree with you entirely. I think of this as branching identity or something like that. I'm different from who I was yesterday or 5 years ago, in the same way that,
Correct.
say, two different systems would grow and become different people. Yeah.
Correct. So if you make 10 copies of me, I mean, I might think it might devalue me, although I'm not really sure about that. I know some people, they get freaked out about it. I personally don't. So then there are 10 Christofs in the world. Yeah.
So now there's one final thing that I also wondered about with IIT, because of course IIT says a lot about all sorts of systems that could have levels of consciousness. And I wonder how it ties back into, say, the evolution of consciousness and the evolutionary role of consciousness. I mean, I don't think that consciousness necessarily has a great role to play for a rock or for a star, but for various types of animals, certainly it does.
Okay, so it's a very interesting question. So the function of consciousness. So A, of course, you can ask as a physicist, what is the function of electric charge? All right. Clearly, our brains work because of charge separation, right? We have all of our neurons, have a memory potential of 100 millivolt because of differential charge separation, right? So clearly, electric charge is absolutely crucial for any sort of for life, even for muscle cells, right? But no physicist goes around and asks what's the function of charge, right? Same thing with consciousness. Systems don't get selected for consciousness, but ultimately they get selected on whether they propagate themselves successfully. Okay, so we've done a series of papers where we did these simulations of simple animals. Right, so what we have these simple creatures that have simple input sensors, that have output sensors like wheels, that live in a world where they have to, for example, they have to move through a labyrinth, and they have a genome that encodes their brain. And early on, it's completely random. And you take 1,000 of these creatures with random brains, and you put them in front of a labyrinth. And then most will just stand still. Some will move to the left. Some will move one step into the labyrinth. You selected the top 10% that's gotten anywhere close to, into the labyrinth, and then you take their genomes and mutate them, just like in evolution. You put them down again, and then maybe you get lucky and one will make 2 steps towards the labyrinth, right? And so you do this over, eons, over 100,000 of iterations, and then you find that yes, these, it's essentially a random search in these high-dimensional spaces. These machines will become more adaptive. They become better through genetic algorithms at executing this task. In this case, traversing the labyrinth. And at the same time, their integrated information goes up. Why? Well, because what you do take all these different sensors and combine their information. And the more you combine the sensors and the motor, the effectors, the more powerful this machine is, the better it becomes adapted. In fact, there's a sort of a quantitative relationship between the complexity of the external world and the representation of the external world in its brain. And so you could say, in the strict sense, consciousness doesn't have any function. In the wide sense, it serves to adapt. The more conscious you are, the better you become adapted to the particular environment. Mm-hmm. And so evolutionary, that's the driver why we evolved to have these big brains.
Yeah. So now I'm not entirely sure whether you're saying that that the level of consciousness, so phi, is almost epiphenomenal to evolution, or whether you're saying that there is a natural selection process that leads to a greater phi, which is kind of what you said at the end there about the animats. But then again, these animats may have been implemented in software, so then they have the same phi the whole time.
Well, yeah. So it's a spandrel. It's an evolutionary spandrel. So we did not get selected for the ability to do math or compose, symphonies, right? Yet you have people who can do math and who can do symphonies, right? So what evolution selects is behavior, right? So the better your behavior, the more adaptive your behavior, the more likely you survive. And I'm saying that my behavior becomes more adaptive if I have a nervous system that has a higher phi, because it integrates more of all the different sources of input sensors, of internal module, and of output sensors. So in the strict sense, consciousness isn't what's being selected, but behavior. But in a wider sense, my degree of adaptation relates to the integrated information of my brain.
So
do you understand the difference?
I do understand the difference, but it makes me wonder whether it would then be seen as a coincidence, let's say, that a human might have a higher phi than, say, a Drosophila or something like that.
No,
because the behavior could have evolved to be more sophisticated, even if Drosophila or human had a brain that was running on a von Neumann computer.
Yes, but we did. Yes, but if you engineer a system, you can in principle take our human brain and engineer it on a von Neumann machine.
Oh, no, you could have software DNA too, right? It doesn't have to be.
No, because it's not robust. So if you show that, von Neumann architectures, where you have nice architectures that hardly overlap, where everything is separated. I used to build chips. I know this. It's what you do when you actually build ASICs. You try to isolate everything. But in a real physical system, everything to first order talks to everything else. So you would never get these systems evolved in an actual world. They're simply not robust. Yes, you can build them, you can engineer them, but they wouldn't evolve by natural selection. Remember, natural selection is random search. And you don't get these clean von Neumann architecture if you do random search. Those you only get if you have somebody who looks down at it and says, well, I don't want all these interactions. I only want those two transistors to talk to this transistor. You'd never get that in the natural world.
So there's really a separate reason why nature would prefer the whole parallel brain anyway, even before we talk about evolving to better behavior. It's just that it's more robust, and that's what you get, and therefore.
Yeah, I mean, it's not so much preferred. Those are the brains. So this is really interesting if you actually do these evolutionary games. What you discover, yes, it's to a first extent, if you have these simple brains, you evolve them by random selection. Everything connects to everything else. To a first order. I mean, it's not 100%, but it's a very high. And in fact, that's what we see. So, we are specialists in this. We do this connectome. We do mesoscopic connectivity, microscopic connectivity of both human and mouse brain. And you see they have very high degrees of connectivity, much higher than, for example, a Facebook graph or anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
Or same thing with protein, right? One protein will have binding with thousands of other proteins, not just with one or two. That is the character of evolved system, which is very different from the character of an engineered system. So you could engineer systems where you have high intelligence and high adaptive behavior, at least in principle, that have very low phi or no phi.
Indeed, yeah. And just as you could create something with a very high phi that has very low behavior and adaptability, like, for instance, XOR model example that
exactly, and that Scott Alfson example is actually happening now in the form of. Do you know what these cerebral organoids are?
Yes, yeah.
Induced pluripotent stem cells. We can now build that are, they're like 3-4 millimeters across. They contain 500,000 to 1 million neurons, and now they develop them like 9 or 10 using 5 transcription factors. They begin to have synapses, to have action potentials. In theory, at least in principle, they could have relatively high phi, yet without having intelligence, because they don't have inputs, they don't have outputs.
Indeed.
But again, that's an engineered system. That's not a system that evolved, because if you don't have inputs and if you don't have outputs, you're not going to evolve.
Okay, this was actually very, very informative. I was really wondering about that whole evolutionary part of this. I've sort of run through all of my questions, except that I guess I didn't ask you directly what your take is on Chalmers' hard problem of consciousness. Is that something you'd want to respond to as well?
Sure, yeah. So IIT bypasses that hard problem. So the hard problem comes when you look at the brain and you say, so what Francis Crick and I said earlier on our first paper in 1989, 1919 said, we think 40 hertz gamma oscillation are critical sign of consciousness. Okay. Then, so let's say it's true. Okay. Then the challenge is, well, why should 40 hertz give rise to consciousness, right? Or why 38? Why not 38 hertz? Or why not 42? Or if you say it's those neurons, then I say, well, why is it those neurons and those not here neurons? So anytime you point to any mechanism, right? Even if it's quantum mechanics, even if it's a collapse of the wave function, you have to say, well, why is it this but not that? That's a hard problem. So let me show you something. You got the brain?
Yeah.
Okay. And you're trying to squeeze the juice of consciousness out of the brain, right? You squeeze it and you get the juice. You have to explain why, if you squeeze it, you get the juice of consciousness, but not if you squeeze it here, but only if you squeeze it there, okay? But IIT bypasses that. IIT doesn't say, oh, it's in the posterior cortex, that's my theory. IIT says, no, you start with experience itself. You start with, how does it feel to be conscious? What does it, if you feel anything, angry, upset, happy, green, angry, what are its aspects? So it starts with experience and then goes to its physical substrate. So it doesn't have the problem that the opposite route has, pointing at something in the brain and saying, this is what makes you conscious. Why this and not that?
Yeah, or a specific area of the brain, etc. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Let me. Can I leave you with one graph?
Absolutely. I was just going to ask, is there anything else you think that people should know that I haven't asked you yet? So yeah, material,
so
very welcome.
Conceptually, I think it's very important to separate consciousness from intelligence. Okay, so
yeah,
Michael, can you see this?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so conceptually, you can have, at least you can have a plane. I call it the IC plane, intelligence consciousness plane, right? So at least conceptually, consciousness is experience. It's about feeling something, and intelligence is about reasoning about the world or acting. Ultimately, it's about acting in the world, taking a lot of input and responding to those input, learning, etc. So it's ultimately about behavior. Conceptually, they're two very different things. And I think if we look at creatures, like for example, evolved creatures, I would submit throughout evolution that they lie along this diagonal, where as their brain size goes up, let's say from a worm to a fly to a bee to a mouse to a dog to humans to humans, the intelligence goes up, their adaptation to the environment, but also their degree of consciousness goes up.
Mm-hmm.
However, you can, in principle, by engineering, have systems that live down here that are very intelligent but have no consciousness, or as we just talked about in terms of cortical organoids or Scott Alson's, XOR gates, you can have things that are on this axis where they may have high level of consciousness, but they're not at all intelligent. And at least it's really important to separate those. So artificial intelligence does not equal artificial consciousness. Those are two different things. Although in evolved creatures like us, intelligence, natural intelligence, always seems to go hand in hand with consciousness. In an engineered system, this does not have to be the case.
Okay, that's a very good final point to make. Thank you very much.
Excellent.